Good morning and welcome to this special council meeting, Tuesday, June 18th, 2024. I'd like to call the meeting to order and acknowledge that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Before I ask for the approval of the agenda, I would like to add an acknowledgement that I would like to read. So if someone would move the approval of the agenda with the acknowledgement, please. Moved by Councillor Haysom, seconded by Councillor Hubley. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion is carried unanimously. So I would like to read the acknowledgement. Before I read this acknowledgement, I'd like to thank resident Andrew Himmelman for bringing this day to Council's attention. MODL accepts requests for proclamations or acknowledgements to commemorate special days, weeks, or months. We also accept flag-raising requests from the community. There is information on our website on how to submit a request to Council for these items. Once an event has been brought forward the first time, the staff will ensure it is acknowledged on an annual basis. Thursday, June 13th was Men's Mental Health Awareness Day. This is a day to bust the stigma that discourages men from talking about their mental health and seeking help if problems emerge. While rates of mental illness are comparable between men and women, men are less likely to recognize, talk about, and seek treatment for their illness. Yet up to 10% of men experience paternal postpartum depression, and 80% of people who die by suicide are men. We should all be aware that men's symptoms of depression may include physical pain, anger, or irritability. Intervening early is the best predictor of a healthier adulthood, so the mental health of adolescent boys and young men needs more attention and resources. We encourage everyone to learn more about the signs and symptoms of mental health problems and talk honestly with the men in their lives. On this day, we are reminded that mental illness doesn't discriminate, and everyone should feel comfortable seeking help. I will now go down to staff reports 3.1, Planning Department 3.1.1, second reading, Coastal Protection Regulations. And we have Reed, a familiar face. Yes, I did at the beginning. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, everyone. I don't have a formal presentation this morning, but before even we get into this topic, I did want to just acknowledge my colleague Ella, who is typically here beside me and who has done the heavy lifting on this work, had her baby boy who was born yesterday morning. So a big congratulations to her.
Congratulations.
Yeah, she
who was sitting here last week at the public hearing.
Yes, yeah. So just wanted to recognize that. So mom and baby are doing very well. So yeah. So as I mentioned, I don't have a formal presentation. There's a staff report which is very similar to the one which was included in the agenda package for the public hearing. The report here is a recommendation with a motion for council to adopt or approve second reading. There were a couple of clarification notes I did want to raise, however, this morning. There have been some questions around, so that what this would do would be to amend the current municipal planning strategy. We already have a municipal-wide municipal planning strategy. That's a mouthful. And what it does is has policies that apply to the entire municipality within it. It sets the policy framework for the regulations that are contained in our current secondary plan areas. And so what this amendment would do would be to add additional sections to that existing MPS document that pertain specifically to the coastal areas. And there's a map as a part of that amendment which would define where those regulations apply. Other areas within the municipality would be unaffected by that because the map dictates where these regulations would apply. When we move into the mandatory minimum planning requirements process, which has been called MODL 2040, This is a multi-year project that, as required by the province, has to establish minimum planning standards across the municipality, addressing things like agricultural lands, housing. There's several different things that need to happen, but that process will take look at those things like inland water bodies, agricultural lands, and things like that. Those will be looked at individually on their own. You cannot take policies that apply to the coastline and apply them inland. That wouldn't be practical and it wouldn't work. There's a substantial amount of work to look at inland areas separately from this work. The second clarification I wanted to make was around, Council had previously requested that we outline properties that may be impacted by the coastal protection regulations. So what we did was, Council specifically had asked about what properties, would potentially be undevelopable going forward. So we did some calculations and we did bring those forward a few different times and outline kind of what some of the calculations were that we made to come up with those numbers. And I believe there was a 111. That was that's an approximate number of properties that potentially would be, could not build a new home on those properties that are currently vacant. There are many, many more properties that are impacted by the regulations, but not necessarily undevelopable. So that the specific conversation had been a request from Council to look at what are those properties that really are going to be affected most, and those regulations may cover the whole property. So that's has been the focus, but there have been some questions that we've communicated via email that said there are this many coastal properties total, and so obviously there are a lot more coastal properties total that would be affected by the regulations in some way. Some of those, it's a matter of there's a large property, a portion of it has some new regulations that apply to it, whereas the other ones that are more dramatically impacted. And in some of that, it does get a little bit complicated because we have our existing plan areas, such as Riverport that already has a 20-meter setback, or Oakland and Princess Inlet that already have elevation requirements. So in looking at how many properties are impacted, you have to actually look a little bit more in detail about, do they have any to begin with? What are they? And then how big are they and how dramatically impacted are they? So we've had some communication around that, but just to raise the fact that there's several different factors that have gone into that. So that's 2 points I wanted to make, but I'm happy to answer questions going forward too.
Are there any questions? Councillor Moore.
Thank you, Reid. Can you go back to your statement that you said about inland? Yeah, I kind of missed it.
Sure. Yeah. So inland areas are the areas that aren't affected by the coastal protection regulations. The process that we will take to look at what are the policies that the council wants to take for, protection of wetlands or protection of water bodies inland is a separate process. We have staff doing research now as a part of MODL 2040. That's very different. There are different considerations when you're looking at inland and freshwater. And so the regulations, the recommendations for regulations will be different for those inland areas, and there will be a different opportunity to discuss them. We very much are not treating that as the same. And the province requires that we have certain minimum requirements that we have to meet.
Yeah.
But there will be an opportunity for lots of discussion and lots of public input when we talk about that.
Thank you.
Any further questions, clarifications? Councillor DeLong.
Thank you. I have a couple questions, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I absolutely support the work that staff has done on coastal protection, and I plan
Could you speak up just a bit, please?
Sorry, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, so I plan on supporting this, but I have some thoughts and questions that I wanted to voice before we move ahead. following the public hearing, and over the past year of public engagement, I think we've established this document as a great starting place. But having heard from many residents in the most recent session, are we able to incorporate their concerns in any way without restarting the whole process, or is this is as is?
In order to amend what's currently being debated today, with other than very, very minor, like spelling and grammar changes, you'd need to go back to first reading again.
Councillor DeLong.
Thank you, I appreciate it. So we had decided to revisit this as a 5-year review, and I still think that that is a lot of time between now and then, especially if we're going to be looking at tidal rivers and so forth. Are those going to be part of the inland planning strategy, or are they going to have their own kind of lens put on them?
Yeah, like with all of those inland areas that don't currently have zoning, yes, that would be part of that work. They would be treated like any other inland water course. Yep. So the question is, would that be sooner than 5 years from now? And the answer is yes, because we need to do the MODL 2040 work sooner than 5 years.
Yeah, and would they be treated the same as other inland bodies of water, though, or would they be treated more like coastline?
I can't say for sure kind of how we'd address that, but similarly how I think the La Haven needs to be treated differently, not even the tidal portion, like the further upper areas, it's a sizable water course, and it does need to be treated differently than some of the smaller streams and things like that. But we do need to look at water bodies and water courses comprehensively as part of the next kind of phase of work. Yeah.
Did you have another question? Okay.
If I may. And I also wanted to bring up the points that were highlighted by the group that presented from West Haver Beach, and whether or not we will be talking about infilling in our municipal zoning. I think they made some very good points, and they've asked if there will be an opportunity to encode in bylaws measures that will determine damage or deter such damage as infilling in coastal wetlands from occurring in environmentally sensitive coastal and wetland areas. They also say that they've received legal advice to the effect that the MGA does allow municipalities to enforce bylaws on infilling.
We're preparing a staff report that's an information report outlining all of those issues as a kind of response to some of those questions that were brought up. So I anticipate that we'll have that at the next council meeting. But there's a very narrow opportunity to do that, and it relates to identified flood risk areas, and that is the only way that that infilling can be addressed is when it's been an identified floodplain through a proper process to identify areas that are at flood risk. The report will outline that, but we will address that question and the other things that were brought up as part of that next week.
Deputy Mayor Roigel.
Thank you. I have a couple of things, but the first thing is I would like to clarify a remark made at the public hearing in reference to what I said at a council meeting at first reading. I felt it was insinuated by the remarks at the public hearing and in a letter that we received that I gave direction to staff to write letters. But rather, I had asked if letters could be sent to the 50 people who had property along the coast who will not be able to build on their property if the Coastal Protection Act is passed, due to their land being 15 meters or less. My remarks was made during the discussion time, and no direction was given by council to staff, and I just wanted to clarify that. I do have other things. Am I able to continue on?
Please.
Okay, so mine are more relating to the document itself. Under coastal flooding 14.4.13, I'm a bit confused from information on all the land issues we have been discussing this year and a half about the different levels of government and the departments and whose regulations trump who. Okay, so throughout this process, I have heard that people can add more ground and rocks to their property to bring it up to the 3.97 meter height. Do they need permission from the government body to do this, or can they just go ahead and do it? That's one question.
Okay.
I'll do each question one at a time.
Yep. So most of the time, they don't need any permission. If they're dealing with water, if they're dumping into the water to do that, then they absolutely need to be dealing with the province for approvals. But if they're just, there's a dump truck dumping rock into an existing, flat area that they have and they want to raise it up, then the only role that we would play would be when they get to the development permit stage.
Okay. So for municipalities, we are only concerned with the building permit part of the development. All infilling is handled by the Department of Environment if they want to do it in the water or in a low rut lining area. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the case. It's the province kind of controls what can be, because essentially anything below the high water mark will be considered Crown land. And so if you're encroaching onto Crown land, there's a process where you need permission to either do something or, there's a few people who have those water lots that have additional rights to do some things, but they still need special permission to do that. If it's a wetland that's mapped and regulated by the provinces, we were kind of just talking about some of those issues. There's a different part of the Department of Environment that, specifically regulates and permits what happens on wetlands.
Okay. So in our agenda, it says that coastal erosion policies identification of a 30-meter erosion risk area from the top of bank or ordinary high water mark, correct? Okay, so my question is, because the bank may be quite a ways away from the beach, can I use the ordinary high water mark as the beginning of my 30-meter setback rather than the bank that divides the dry land from the sandy or the beach?
No.
I have to use the bank.
The bank needs to be used unless it's a very, you can picture from some of those very low-lying sandy areas where there isn't a discernible bank. That's why there's that allowance to use the high water mark. It's only in those circumstances where there is no bank.
But in some areas, for example, Hurdles Beach, for example, there's the water, the sand, and then there's rocks, then the bank, right? So I'm already back many, many meters. So can we not, it just would make more sense to me to be and or just or, rather than, what is the reasoning? If you could please explain the reasoning.
That was identified as a best practice by some of the experts that we consulted from the Green Shores Network. So they have regulations in BC, the BC Stewardship Center, as well as Transcoastal Adaptations here in Nova Scotia. And we consulted there. They have a fairly comprehensive guidebook on shoreline development, and they specifically talked about those two scenarios where they, recommend that the top of bank be used. And that's because the bank itself is showing us where the erosion is occurring. And so you wouldn't want to, allow, what the bank is showing us is that you want to allow 30 meters of stable ground as the setback. Because if you go beyond that, you're getting into the area that is continually experiencing erosion. It's like an ideal situation is that you always have a top of bank, and that's always what you use. It's more about focusing on that and recognizing that there are a few scenarios where you might not have that situation, that there's an allowance to use a high water mark, only because there's not another ideal measurement point. I think we do want to, the 30 meters is something that we do want to ideally be using the top of bank for, and only in those specific circumstances where we cannot discern that would we want to go to the high water mark.
Okay, so now my problem is with the wording of the document. It says in 4.14.1A, that if the top of bank is not discernible, but it can be seen, all right. No, that's not it. I just have a lot written down here, because I was doing lots of thinking and writing. Okay, so 14.4.2B. All right, so it's, to have its description, I'm thinking there should be an A there, because it's referring, if you look at it, it's referring to just 4.14.2, which is just the description, right? And the A says you're not to do it. And then B, D, and E say, are referring to rather than, right? Do you see that? Do you see just how it's read? And I just want it to be very specific. If we're going to do it, we need to have it very specific.
I see your point, yeah. Now, the, 4.14.2, which is the, what have you described the description? It isn't just a description, it does have a policy number attached to it. So there are other sections in the plan in cases where there's no number. And in those cases, I think we would be more looking at that as a description. But we're talking about the land use bylaw here, and basically everything in there is
Okay, so it's
part of the
not,
regulation.
we don't need to do that. I just wanted to make sure that it's not in future
Yeah, we don't need
years
to-
by other planners and other people reading it differently.
Yep.
I just want to make sure that it's very
Absolutely.
clear
Yep.
to everybody. Okay. So now wetlands. Can you please confirm that only wetlands will be considered for the purpose of these regulations that the province says are a wetlands and not my neighbor?
Yes, it all comes down to what's on the map.
Okay.
So this always refers to the map, and the map that's been put together takes the provincial wetland layer and uses only that information. The municipality can make amendments, further amendments over time, but there would need to be an amendment process that's public engagement and everything to add to that.
Okay. And a resident who said he was a professional engineer and he's working in our area and is involved in projects along the coast right now. He spoke on the 13th and he asked some questions that I would like to have some answers for. He mentioned that the slope of the land can change with the distance back from the coast. So anything that's 50 meters could actually really be 60 meters, depending on the slope. So then like something that's 20 could be 30 and so on. So how will that be handled?
I mean, I think we were just talking about how the top of bank is always going to be used as that setback distance. And at the higher you go, like Hurdles area is going to have, they'll have that slope. So it will be further from the water itself. But higher elevations, especially when you're dealing with some of that erodible material, they have a higher risk. So, I've talked to experts, particularly about the Hurdles Beach area, and they're aware of, in certain circumstances, whole sections that would, slide down at one time. So there is a greater risk if you have higher elevation. So we do want to make sure that things are further back. When an engineer or other professional who's doing that erosion risk assessment, that's one of the factors that they look at as part of that tool. They do look at the material, they do look at the slope, because the slope will help determine, how risky is it. Like in a really, really rocky area, you might have a vertical slope, and that's because it's not experiencing a lot of erosion. But in those places, like we can picture like Hurdles, where it has that gradual, you can see the gravel kind of coming away from the material that's sliding down. That would be an indication that it's quite kind of erodible and at risk.
But I
yeah,
think it was
experts.
that because of the slope, when you measure it, it's actually farther back
Yes.
than what it really
Yep.
is.
Yep. But again, I think it's about, the intention is that that slope is there because it's demonstrating that it's an erosion risk. It's an erodible area.
Okay.
And we do want to be measuring 50 meters back from an area that's solid ground, and we're not including part of an area that's already being eroded in that 30 meters. Because like if you had one of those really stable rocky areas like we have in Blue Rocks or whatever, those are typically, there's not a big slope because those rocks, you know, they're not eroding basically. And so with those situations, you don't need to be measuring up, you know, further than the 30 meters. It's you know, right at the edge because it's not experienced that level of erosion.
Okay. Now, he also talked about doing benchmarks for ordinary high tide mark around the municipality. And because of, as we already know, surveyors are hard to get right now because they're so overworked. And I'm just wondering whether or not if council would be interested or if staff to look into and investigate the best course of action to create high tide benchmarks around our coast to help to develop them along, to help development to move along and not to impede by lack of professionals, you know, in the work, and maybe update them every 5 years. I don't know if that's something or
Yeah,
not, would be a good idea. Oh, is it? I don't know.
I think I probably would want to have a further discussion about that. I'm not 100% sure what the benefits of that might be. My understanding, I think, is that the elevation where people need to, the 3.97 meter elevation requirement is something that you could establish some benchmarks around. However, my understanding is also that you still would need to have a surveyor come on site to do that work anyway. And if they had a reference benchmark nearby, like maybe that would make the process a little bit quicker. Now I know our development officer Norma has had some conversations with surveyors locally that do have the capacity to take on some of this work, and they're not entirely, you know, that's not months long waits. We certainly do want to make sure we have good communication with that folks who are working in that field and other related fields about these new things, what the expectations are. You know, they expect that there's going to be new requests for their work, but that's already kind of started. I still would be happy to have further conversations with anybody if there's pieces of work that could be done to kind of help things move more quickly. But, you know, I think part of that is going to be as we start to talk to those professionals and see, you know, how are they experiencing doing that work over time? Is there changes that can be made? I'm not sure we're quite there yet, but, you know, Norma does have a lot of discussions with our local kind of surveying community and other folks who are supporting kind of the building process, and you know, is identifying those things, you know, right away as they come up and keeping them in the loop as well.
Well, I do appreciate the planning department's work that they've done and working with us and working with the public, and already it seems like you are on top of it, and I appreciate the answers to my questions and the clarification to them. I really do appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Councillor Hubley. Did you have your?
I'll go, because I do have something to say. So Reed and everyone else that worked on this, I don't want you to misunderstand that I do appreciate all your hours and your knowledge. But I remain against this, not because I disagree with protecting the coast. I actually agree with protecting the coast. I'm in favor of a vegetative buffer. I'm also in favor of an education campaign, something to help educate property owners on different ways to protect the coast and their investment. My concerns are with the 111 property owners that could be told that their property is worthless. It's my feeling that not much consideration has been given for those 111 property owners, and has anyone put themselves in their situation to really understand the financial impact. I'm sure some of the property owners have worked their entire lives to have coastal property. Now the day has come that we're going to tell them it can't be developed. In my mind, that goes beyond protecting the coast. For this reason, I will not be supporting the coastal protection regulations.
Councillor Bell.
Thank you. I'll limit myself to 2 questions or comments. The first one, part of this was already mentioned by Mr. Shepherd, but I think it needs to be emphasized. And based on comments and public understanding, I think we just need to highlight this. when we speak of repealing the existing municipal planning strategy, I was led to believe that some thought the coastal regulations would be applied municipal-wide. That's not the case. What in fact it means is that coastal regulations is one of several guidelines to come. As we review all areas, there may be several guidelines to come, all fit into this particular file. As we review all areas, there may be sections for inland water bodies, sections that regulate cluster development, and what needs to be emphasized is that the province has made it a requirement to have all municipalities do municipal planning. This isn't just something that MODL grabbed out of the sky and said, oh, let's champion this. So I think it needs to be emphasized. Correct me if I've made any mistake in my interpretation.
No, that's 100% correct. Yep. And if you look at, there's a handful of municipalities still left in the province. The municipality district of Lunenburg is one of them that does not have zoning and land use rules across the municipality. That time is ticking, and the province has a mandate and legislation that requires this municipality to have the same comprehensive land use policies that almost all other municipalities across the province already have.
Thank you. And my second assessment is based on risk assessment. And this was a comment made at the public hearing, which maybe there isn't a clear understanding of what we're asking or proposing. There was a comment made that the 30-meter setback on a cliff was unreasonable and made no sense. Now, in that case, there is a possible 15-meter setback that can be considered. They just need to apply for it and have a professional sign off a document saying that the proposed building is relatively safe with the known conditions. So it's not always a 30-meter setback. So I just wanted to clarify that point that I think may have got missed by some individuals. Again, correct me if I'm wrong.
That's correct, yeah. So the 30-meter setback can be reduced. Now, they're down to a minimum of 15 meters, which is 50 feet, and the 15 meters is the minimum because that's where that vegetative buffer needs to be in place. But for folks who are looking at properties that are very rocky, or they have a limited footprint, or for whatever reason they'd like to try to reduce that down, they can go through a risk assessment and hire one of those professionals that is already doing work in Queens and things like that to come in and do a site assessment. And one of those challenges with erosion is it's very site specific, and so that's why it makes sense to look at each site differently, and they can make an assessment and potentially reduce it down to 15 meters.
This is why I feel it's very important that individuals read the document and understand what is being proposed. It's hard to defend something when someone calls you with a predetermined outcome, and I ask them, where did you get this information? Well, my neighbor told me, and probably his neighbor told him. So I think it's very important that we evaluate the possible outcome on this policy on what is being actually proposed, not what your neighbor told you. Thank you.
Councillor Stanton.
Thank you. Some interesting conversation. This is a very divided policy, as we see from the public who presented here. It's very divided. I'm not supporting it, and I haven't supported it all along because I think the province let us down big time by taking 49 municipalities and making us, or legislating that we do this work without the expertise that a lot of municipalities don't have to enforce it. So I think they let us down big time. I think the NSFM let us down by not polling the municipalities they represent to find out if we all want to go along with this. And that's, and then go back to the province to say, no, the majority of our municipalities don't want to have to do this. So they let us down as well. And it's nothing personal, believe me. But I do have two questions, if I might. And the one is, when someone applies for a permit, if this goes through and someone applies for a permit, who makes the decision whether they get that permit or if it has to go through an engineer to do an environmental assessment, or someone of that designation to do an assessment? That's my one question.
Our development officer would make a determination about whether somebody meets any of the requirements or not. So the first step that they do is they need to apply for a development permit. And at that stage, that's when our development officer will review more in depth and look, for example, like is the structure located 30 meters away from that top of bank, or is it actually, are they looking to build closer? And if they're looking to build a bit closer, maybe they've also submitted a coastal erosion risk assessment by that professional. And then, we have a guidance document that's for those people who are doing that assessment. So, we know that that's what they have to follow. As part of the elevation requirements, if they're looking to build in a low-lying area, then our development officer would be looking for, they would flag that as something that they need to be meeting when they do their construction. And then when we're doing our inspections, they would be kind of getting a surveyor to show that the living area of the home is located at the elevation that it needs to be, that 3.97 meter elevation. So it's primarily the development officer who's going to be the first line to determine whether they need to be worried about the regulations at all. And then in some cases, they may be looking for clarification, or they may need that study, or they may just be saying, as part of this process, you're going to need to have a surveyor mark, on the building as part of the building process.
Do we have staff on site? Is our development officers on site that we have now capable of making that assessment?
They're capable of making the assessment for when the regulations apply and determining whether they meet the regulations. But often what they do is they rely on those experts like surveyors. Surveyors are one of the people that they work with the most to show, whether they meet the 30 meters or whether they meet the 3.97 elevation. Yeah.
So if I'm building a house in this area where the planning is involved, and it's not real clear, then my obligation would be to hire a surveyor to show exactly where the property is on the land and make sure it complies with the regulations.
It depends, yeah. Like if you have a very large parcel and you're looking to build right in the middle of it and you're nowhere near a property line, in cases like that, it's very unlikely that the development officer would request something like a property boundary survey or location certificate. But the development officer does have the authority to ask for those certificates or confirmations when things are getting quite close. So if somebody says, I'm building on the coast, but I'm building right at the 30 meter mark, well, in that case, we probably want to say, okay, well, you just need to make sure that you get the surveyor to stake it and just be sure that you're showing us exactly, because if it's right on the line, then we need to know where the line is.
Okay, I just have one more question, if I might. No, I guess you answered my question, so I'm done. Thank you.
Councillor Vino.
Thank you. I have one question and then a comment I'd like to make. Could you briefly describe, without getting into locations or dates, how we've gone about the public input, ensuring that we've got residents' feedback, whether that be letters, social media? A brief synopsis for those listening.
Sure. So the process was started over a year ago, and the first part involved a lot of research and background information. And so that involved a lot of consultation with experts in the field of erosion and flooding and all that stuff. So there was an initial part where we had to gather information from the experts in the field. So there was a lot of kind of stakeholder or expert discussions. And then once we were able to gather that information, understand the issues, there was a fairly substantial public engagement campaign that was held at the beginning. And that was, there wasn't any predetermined policies that were written. It was we were specifically wanting people to weigh in, and we want them to tell us how much of an issue they saw this as, what are the primary concerns they have, what level of regulation they'd be comfortable with. And so that really helped determine the direction that was able to be used. And so that was the most substantial public engagement component. There was a What We Heard report. It was hundreds of residents did a survey, open houses online, postcards, radio, websites, emails, basically every newspapers, every avenue that we could, we reached out to the community. And then there were many different council meetings and planning advisory committee meeting that are public. And as part of that process, we went above and beyond the normal council agenda kind of notice requirements. So we've maintained throughout the process a very substantial email list and Facebook followers. And every time this item has been discussed at council or something new has been brought forward, we reach out to those lists of people. That's not the normal process for council meetings. So we are constantly engaging with the community as this process has moved along. But the second component of the kind of larger public engagement was once the draft documents had been passed first reading, we went out again into what we call information sessions, where we were kind of giving a presentation about what these regulations were, which had been passed first reading. And we were there to answer questions from the public about how might this work or how might this affect my property. So that's been over a year of engagement, and we continue to inform everybody about the process. And we would continue to do that should council pass second reading, as for part of the awareness and engagement with the community and informing them about the new process and everything like that.
Thank you for that. That helps.
Just before you go on, Alex, also, our deputy CAO wanted to comment on the communication piece as well.
Just, we do have a manager of corporate communications. Whenever we have a project of this magnitude, we create a home on the Engage website. So all of that information is accessible for anybody that wants to pursue it. We take additional steps beyond simply posting the material so that on social media that information will get boosted, i.e. we're paying to have that be pushed out into people's feeds, in addition to the statutory requirements for newspaper publications and those kinds of things. I think the other critical element for communication on this one is our use of Municipal Matters, which is a physical mail out that goes to every mailbox in the municipality. Coastal protection, because of the length of the project and the engagement that we did, it was featured a number of times. So there were a number of steps that went above and beyond the minimum planning requirements to make sure that our residents were aware of the project as it was going on.
Continue, Councillor Vino.
And just a comment that I wanted to make, and our deputy CEO used a good word, magnitude. This has been a huge process, and I know how important it's been. And I just wanted to say I've attended 100% of all meetings we've had in my district and out of my district, including the online meeting. I've shared it on my own social media. I've answered all email, phone, and in-person inquiries. I have a coastal community, and my vote today will be based on the feedback I've heard from my residents, and I will be in support of this today.
Are there any other questions? I think that was my watch talking to me. Go ahead, Councillor Vino. Councillor Wynot, sorry.
Why not? Yeah, it's just a statement. It's all about money, nothing about the life risk for our emergency services, mostly volunteer, who will be tasked to rescue the public in a catastrophe. And you got to think about that.
Any further questions? I also have a few comments, and I want to go back to the 111 properties that was mentioned. And I also would like to bring in the 45 or 5,500 that was mentioned during the public hearing. And basically that there was, I forget the exact amount that was mentioned, but that there were thousands of properties that would be affected by this. And could you go over what affected actually means in that sense? Because it doesn't, they're still able to add on to existing dwellings and to do things, correct? And if you could.
Sure. Yeah. So when we were looking at the potential impacts of this, we looked first at the number of total properties along the coastline. So there's, if it's 4,500 something or close to 5,000, and then we look at those areas that are already in planned areas. So the Princess Inlet, the Oakland, the Riverport, and take those out of the equation. It basically reduces that by about half. And the reason we look at those is because Riverport and the other communities already have 20-meter setbacks from the coastline already. And most of those communities already have an elevation requirement as well. So those communities are already being impacted by some sort of existing regulations that are already in place. And then when we look further at the unzoned areas, we're looking at properties that either are vacant or are already have a home or a structure or other type of use on them. And so the 111 were kind of, that was an analysis that we did to look at vacant only, because we're looking really at potential where you could build in the future and whether that was a possibility or not. And so that 111 was looking at the most kind of severely impacted by the regulations. This is also too high level to really say with a certainty that those properties were in fact kind of impacted in that way, because in some cases we don't know if they are buildable at all. We don't know whether somebody could even get a permit for a structure, if there was room for a structure, if there was room for a septic system and a well. There's a lot of unknowns about when we look at that level to say we think there's 111 properties. Several of those are property unknown, which is an indication to us that somebody isn't paying taxes on it, or we don't know who the owner is. It might just be a sliver of land out there that we actually don't know who owns it, but that it wouldn't have a lot of value to someone if we don't even know who the owner is. So that's some of the factors that we considered when we're looking at those, most highly impacted ones. But in terms of the ones that are impacted, but still developable, yeah, they very much could be a large parcel. They might have a home on them now. That home might be in either the flood risk area or the erosion risk area. If that's the case, they can continue to build and add on to that home. They can add on a second story. They can add on above. They can add on behind, and by behind I mean away from the water side. If they're just in the flood risk area, they can add on in any direction, up to 100% increase from the existing footprint. So there are exceptions and allowances for people who are in those situations where the home is there now and they want to be able to have some flexibility about what they do in the future. For those vacant properties that are a bit larger than the 111 that are out there, that are in unzoned areas, that aren't in Riverport or Princess Inlet or things like that. Those are properties where the landowner might be looking to do an erosion risk assessment in order to build closer to the water. They might be looking to build the structure a little bit higher, or maybe change the design of the structure to make sure the habitable space is elevated at the proper requirement. Or in some cases, they may just already be choosing to build back a little bit and outside of any of the regulation areas. So we might, on paper, see that property is impacted by the regulations, but they might have no intention of building, in those regulated areas. And therefore, there's absolutely nothing really standing in the way of those folks kind of moving ahead with what they wanted to do. So it's very site specific. But, you know, we tried to kind of look at different scenarios, and there are a lot of different cases. But at the end of the day, it's, you know, we're dealing with a lot of coastal areas that do have zoning already in place. So that's a huge consideration when we look at what the potential impact is.
And that takes me to my second part. So Princess Inlet, Oakland, Riverport, all have municipal planning that have setbacks of 20 meters. And we're proposing 30 meters or 15, a vegetative buffer of 15. So in some cases, it's less than what is already throughout those planned districts. I don't recall in the past hearing from residents in those areas that their land was rendered undevelopable. But I would think that it would have had the same effect when these municipal planning regulations were put in place in those areas. The other question I had was around the 95 percentile. And I believe there was some questions asked around this at the public hearing, and why 95 over going to 55, and is the 3.97 the actual number that should be in this document? And if you could just, I know we've heard it several times, but if we could just, for the record.
Sure. And we've asked that question to a lot of other jurisdictions in the province. We've also asked that question to professors at the School of Planning and folks who work in kind of flood risk mitigation. That's a best, what's the term I'm looking for? But that's a commonly kind of used calculation. It's when you're dealing with flood risk, the approach is always to take a cautious approach to where you draw the line at what areas are most vulnerable. And so, when you look at how people do flood protection all over North America and Europe, they use things like the 1 in 100, year flood, but basically it's saying a 1% chance. And so they establish regulations that are saying, in any year there could be a 1% risk of this event happening each year. And so that is saying that there's a 99% chance that there wouldn't be, but they still have regulations in place to recognize that is that risk. And so similarly, the 95th percentile is the sea level rise projection that's being used here. And it's saying that there's a 95% chance that the sea level rise will be lower than that amount. And so that's taking kind of a cautious approach, which is what everyone else who has these regulations is doing, to not underestimate what the potential is. We don't want to split it down the middle and say, well, there's a 50% chance that it might be actually higher than this. And that's only one component of what the total elevation is calculated of. Just as substantial is the storm surge number that makes up the 3.97. The storm surge number is also a very important calculation in that. So there's several different things that we've talked about that before that go into it. 3.97 is a big number, but even having said that, we didn't take into account wave uprush. And so the properties that are exposed to the open ocean can experience, 1, 2, and up and higher meter additional water levels caused by waves. So yes, it's taking a cautious approach, but it's still not considering all of the elements that we could be, looking at in the future. So it's trying to find a balance there. But when we look at some of the work that's going on, there's a particular project in HRM that's being done on Shore Road in Eastern Passage to raise that road up and look at some protection there. It's been experiencing a lot of, it's similar to Blue Rocks, and it's experiencing a lot of flooding and erosion on that area. And they've factored in wave uprush in some of that work, and it significantly changed the consideration, the elevation that they need to meet. There's a lot that goes into it, but at the end of the day, we want to have a cautious approach to flooding. And if it, and 2100 means, we're still, we've still got some space here. We're still up elevated enough that, if we overshot it a little bit, I think we're happy that we did that rather than undershoot, and the cost of building and the cost of the infrastructure that goes in, and it's there for a long time. That's when we want to be using the best information we have and using the most cautious approach to try to avoid those situations. And we've talked about the 5-year review period. The hope here is that we continue to get new information about sea level rise in particular, and that can be adjusted over time as we kind of get a clearer picture of what's ahead.
And another question that was asked around the 111 properties, there was a question raised about infilling and who's responsible for infilling. And does the provincial government have the jurisdiction to still permit infilling on these 111 properties that would bring them up to grade to allow them to be developable?
Those 111 properties were not deemed to be undevelopable because of the elevation. So because we know when we did that calculation, we didn't take a flood risk property and say that's undevelopable, because we know that it can be infilled. So those were not deemed to be undevelopable. The things that would make those undevelopable were either the wetland setback or the erosion setback.
So are there not provincial wetland jurisdiction setbacks at all?
No, the requirements for wetlands are only about the actual wetland itself and infilling in the area.
Okay. And the provincial mapping tool, these would be identified, these 111 on the provincial mapping tool as well?
Yeah, they should be. Yeah, I mean, the provincial, you're thinking about the flood risk tool that they have?
The tool that the province just launched.
Yep. Yeah, they should be, visible there. I think they have all the properties that we have, so yeah, they should be there as well.
And there was a comment about the NSFM, and the NSFM received 2 official letters from municipalities out of 49 municipalities in the province in relation to flood risk, and one of those was from MODL and one was from CBRM. There was probably 3 or 4 other inquiries in relation to that, for clarification. So, Councillor Statton?
On that line of comment, did NSFM do anything to address the inquiries they received?
Yes, they were turned over to the committee that's responsible for them, and they are taking those inquiries now.
It's a bit
And
late
we
for
have a
some-
member on that committee.
it's a bit
No,
late,
it's been there. It's
But
been
it's a
there.
bit late for us, because now we're in the middle of it all. That's all I'm saying. And when I made that comment, it was nothing personal. I'm just saying that the province didn't do what they were supposed to do. They're downloading it on the municipalities, and if NSFM got any inquiries that they should have been taken to the province, we should have had that looked after before we went this far.
We definitely also forwarded letters to the province ourselves as a municipality. And I will say that no one can be any more disappointed than I was when the province came out with that statement on a Monday, when we were supposed to have our first reading on a Tuesday of that week and had to haul it back to find out exactly what they had actually rolled out, because I don't think anyone understood it from the beginning, and we brought in members from the government to speak to council for clarification purposes at that time. Councillor Haysom? No? Any further discussion? If not, we have one of 3 choices to make here this morning. We recommend that this move forward, and there is a motion to that effect. If there are substantive changes, it would go back to another first reading and start the process and the public input over again. Or it is a fail to pass the motion and move forward with coastal protection. So I am asking for a motion to proceed in whatever manner, and I'm not going to. Councillor DeLong, his hand is up.
I'd be happy to make that motion. To Your Honor, Mayor Bolivar Getson and members of council, I move that Municipal Council repeal and replace the existing Municipal Planning Strategy 2021 and conduct second reading to adopt the new MODL Bylaw 035 Municipal Planning Strategy 2024 containing policies related to coastal protection and the new MODL Bylaw 049 Municipal-wide Land Use Bylaw as presented. I so move.
Moved by Councillor DeLong, seconded by Councillor Wynot. Councillor Moore.
Thank you, and thank you, staff, for all the work. I will be voting against this motion, and I'm not going to list through all the times that I've spoke, and it's been on tape, so the reasons why I am voting against this motion, but I will be voting against this motion. And if anybody wants to call me, I can explain it to them. Just not going to list it all off again.
Councillor Bell on the motion.
Okay, I'd like to have several comments about how I'm voting and why. While we were told that the province was going to develop provincial regulations on coastal protection measures, they avoided passing the regulations because of the political battles that may have to be fought. It was an unpopular topic for many people, depending on where you lived. We took action here, this council. We wrote the provincial government requesting that the province immediately approve and adopt the Coastal Protection Act. All councillors voted unanimously on this. Further, I had asked Municipal Council if they could write a letter to the province to permit MODL pass a moratorium on coastal development until the earlier of the adoption of Municipal Coastal Protection Land Use Bylaw or adoption of the Coastal Protection Act and regulations. Their answer to us was no. This led MODL to conducting efforts during the spring and summer of 2023 through what I thought was a very thorough public engagement focused on coastal protection. MODL was using online websites, open houses, surveys, municipal matters to gather coastal protection thoughts from everybody. It's one of the best, what I thought, information gathering projects that this municipality has ever taken. No matter the topic, perfection is never always in place. In a democracy, we aim to meet the views of the majority, even if many of those who are working have their concerns. We have taken the action to change the direction to address some shortfalls in coastal protection. Together, we need to make stronger communities by understanding that we all have needs and wants. I sometimes struggle between the balance of the needs of the greater community or to satisfy the wants of sometimes more outspoken individuals. I look at the overall picture of what might lead to issues in other council districts and try to weigh the facts. I do feel this is the current MODL coastal protection regulations to meet our current needs as step one. I do understand we may need to make changes, but I'm not willing to force residents off their land. I'm not willing to make some properties devalued unless there are safety issues, and I am willing to listen to the silent majority. I do want to be part of a government, I don't want to be part of a government overreach, being responsible for putting policies or bylaws in place that have a broad paintbrush. But I think after the discussion between councillors, we've modified many sections that made the property owner have abilities to remedy their problems when properties may not fit right in that category. I think we've been very lenient. That's why I think we arrived at this compromised version before us today. That is a democracy, through discussions, through groups like this council. In closing, I want to go back a few years when MODL updated the subdivision and road standards policy bylaw. A thorough public engagement effort was focused on road standards. We listened to members of the public, maybe more than we did the contractors and the developers. The public wanted us to go all the way without accepting any of the investment costs. We moved ahead, and maybe we went too far in some areas, and maybe we got it wrong. That, my friends, is why I'm supporting this revised version of coastal protection land use planning. If passed, it will be reviewed in 5 years, and a future council can fine-tune what we may have missed or what needs to be changed. This version may not have tidal rivers, but in 5 years, version 2 may. We are providing a bylaw that overall protects for the public better overall good. I generally believe in climate change, and we must take measures to protect the general population against careless acts of maybe just a few. The actions we take here today will benefit generations to come. I do support what is before us, and I will be voting yes. Thank you.
Councillor Haysom.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the Planning Department for a lot of hard work. Thank you to the public for a lot of input and a lot of thoughtful consideration. And thank you to everyone on council, because we've had really important and difficult conversations. We have had some compromise. We don't all have to agree, but we're still here and we're still having this conversation. I'm very grateful to all of you for that. We are here in this moment because of the abdication of responsibility from the province. And it doesn't matter which way you cut it. That is why we are here. In 2019, the Coastal Protection Act was passed with all party support. And all polling that the provincial government has done has shown that the majority of people are in support of coastal protection. We have been upheld by the Minister of Environment as, you know, this amazing municipality that's doing the hard work that they refuse to do. We are doing it. We haven't had any engagement from our local MLAs on this topic, even though they know that it's very important. So I think it's really necessary that we state that we are here because of a lack of action by the province. And I am very impressed with our ability to rise to this moment and do the difficult work. I don't think that this bylaw is perfect. I am very pleased that in 5 years there will be a chance to revisit some of those things. Like we've mentioned, tidal rivers it's going to be an issue that needs to be discussed further. Infilling is a concern. But what we've got here is a really good start. And I'm just, very impressed with the work that's happened around this table. So I want to thank all of you, and I want to thank the Planning Department, and of course, members of the public. I will be voting in favor.
Any further discussion on the motion? Question has been called for. All those in favor of the motion? Opposed? Opposed is Councillor Staton, Councillor Hubley, and Councillor Moore. Motion is carried. I would now move down to, actually, I think we're going to take a 10-minute break. And we will come back.